Her strange construction in the forest was met with ridicule. People were convinced that she was wasting her energy. But when winter struck without mercy, opinions changed. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Winter had sealed the forest long before anyone in the settlement admitted that the season was no longer ordinary. Snow lay deep among the pines and firs, pressed flat by weeks of frost. Its surface hardened into a pale crust that swallowed sound. The trees stood close together, their dark trunks rising like pillars, their branches heavy with ice that caught no light and reflected no warmth. The forest did not threaten. It did not welcome either. It simply existed, vast and indifferent, allowing life only to those who understood its rules. Far from the clustered houses of the settlement, beyond the last cleared path and the final fence post, the land sloped downward into a natural hollow. There, partly hidden by earth and stone, stood a structure that most people would not have recognized as a home at all. From a distance, it appeared no more than a low rise in the ground, its surface uneven and dusted with snow, moss frozen into brittle patches along its sides. Only when one came close did the entrance reveal itself, a narrow opening reinforced with stone, angled away from the prevailing wind, framed by timber, darkened with age and smoke. This was where Ingrid Holm lived. The structure was not a cabin, not a hut, not even what settlers would normally call a dugout. It was something older in spirit, built according to principles that predated the settlement itself. The walls were thick, pressed into the slope of the land, reinforced with stone and packed earth. The roof was not truly a roof, but a dome of soil and sod, layered carefully to shed water while holding heat. There were no windows, only a single small vent positioned to allow stale air to escape without drawing warmth out too quickly. Inside, the temperature never matched the cruelty of the air above ground. It did not feel warm in the way a hearth-lit cabin did, but it was stable, steady, and survivable. Ingrid had chosen this place deliberately. She had once lived among others. Years earlier, before the forest became her boundary, she had occupied a small house closer to the settlement, where voices carried easily and the noise of life intruded even at night. That life had been stripped from her piece by piece, not by a single catastrophe, but by accumulation. Loss followed loss, until there was nothing left that tied her to the habits and expectations of communal living. She did not leave in anger. She did not leave in grief. She left because survival, she had learned, required clarity, and clarity could not exist where comfort was mistaken for preparation. The forest offered neither comfort nor illusion. It demanded calculation. Wind direction mattered, snow load mattered, moisture mattered. A poorly chosen wall thickness or an improperly angled entrance could mean death long before spring. Ingrid understood this. She had been raised with such knowledge, though most of it had faded from common use by the time settlers arrived with their square houses and thin roofs, trusting that effort and optimism would be enough. Her dwelling reflected that understanding. Earth was not an enemy to be kept at bay, but an ally to be used. Stone was not decoration, but thermal mass. Minimal space was not deprivation, but efficiency. Ingrid had built the structure years earlier, alone, during seasons when the soil allowed digging and the air allowed endurance. She had tested it through winters that were harsh, but manageable. Yet as this winter deepened, she knew it would be different. The signs were unmistakable. Snow fell earlier than usual and did not melt between storms. The ground froze deeper. The wind shifted more frequently, carrying with it a damp cold that crept into even well-built shelters. Ingrid measured these changes without instruments, through observation and experience. She listened to the sound of the wind through the trees, felt the way cold settled rather than lifted during daylight, noted the way ice clung to stone instead of cracking away. It was during this winter, when most people withdrew further into themselves, that Ingrid took responsibility for 2 lives beyond her own. The boys arrived through necessity, not drama. Word reached her, as word always did, even in the forest. 2 children had been left without guardians, their relatives unwilling or unable to take them in as winter tightened its grip. The settlement debated, delayed, and hoped someone else would intervene. Ingrid did not debate. She did not hope. She went to the settlement on a day when the air burned the lungs and the snow creaked underfoot. She returned with the boys before nightfall. Eric was 12, tall for his age, his movements controlled in a way that suggested he had learned early not to waste energy. His eyes took in everything without comment. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words were measured. Niels, 10, was smaller and visibly worn by fear he did not yet know how to hide. He followed his brother closely, watching Ingrid with uncertainty that bordered on panic, as though expecting at any moment to be sent away again. Their first days in the earth shelter were quiet and difficult. The space was small, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. The boys slept close together, wrapped in heavy coverings that carried the faint smell of smoke and dried herbs. They learned quickly that Ingrid did not raise her voice and did not repeat herself. Rules were simple and absolute. Moisture was to be wiped immediately. Food scraps were accounted for. Tools were returned to their places. Fire was tended with care, not indulgence. Fear did not leave at once, but it changed shape. The boys realized that this place, strange as it was, did not leak cold the way other shelters did. The air inside did not sting their noses. The darkness was complete, but not threatening. Ingrid did not offer reassurance in words, but she offered something more reliable: predictability. As days passed, Ingrid observed the boys as carefully as she observed the weather. Eric noticed patterns quickly. He learned where supplies were kept and how often they were checked. Niels learned more slowly, but his attention to small tasks was precise. Ingrid adjusted her expectations accordingly. Survival, she knew, was not uniform. Each person contributed differently. Outside, the winter continued to deepen. The forest seemed to close in as snow accumulated on branches, and the paths disappeared beneath white drifts. Ingrid ventured out daily, never for long, always with purpose. She checked the structure for signs of stress, examined the way snow settled against the earth dome, and measured the humidity inside by touch and smell rather than instruments. It was during one such inspection that she recognized the approaching limit of her shelter's design. The earth dome had served her well, but snow was accumulating faster and heavier than in previous years. Wet layers pressed down upon older, frozen ones, increasing the load. The soil absorbed moisture, and while the structure was sound, Ingrid understood that endurance was not infinite. Earth held heat, but it also held weight. Left unaddressed, the pressure would eventually cause problems not immediately visible. That evening, as the boys ate in silence, Ingrid considered her options. Retreating to the settlement was not one of them. She had not brought the boys here to abandon preparation at the first sign of difficulty. The solution was not to change the structure, but to protect it. She would build above it. The idea was not new. It had existed in her memory for years, drawn from methods once common in colder lands, where snow was treated as a force to be redirected rather than endured. A secondary roof, raised above the earth dome, would take the burden of snow and wind, creating an air barrier that stabilized temperature and reduced moisture infiltration. It would not touch the existing structure. It would stand independently, anchored in the frozen ground, a shield, rather than an addition. The boys listened as Ingrid explained only what they needed to know. There was work to be done. The winter would not wait. Beyond the forest, in the settlement, people laughed when they heard. They laughed because they did not understand the forest, the earth, or the difference between surviving a winter and mastering it. Ingrid did not hear the laughter yet, but she felt its presence, distant and irrelevant. She stepped outside into the snow, marking the ground where posts would stand, already calculating angles and loads. Above her, the trees creaked softly in the cold. The forest watched without judgment. The line had been drawn. The winter would decide who had prepared and who had merely hoped. The decision, once made, did not trouble Ingrid's sleep. She woke before dawn as she always did. The air inside the earth, shelter still and cold, but steady, unchanged by the storm that had passed during the night. Snow had fallen again, heavier this time, packing itself against the slope above the entrance. Ingrid rose quietly, careful not to disturb the boys, and sat for a long moment with her back against the stone wall, listening. The forest responded in its own language, the distant crack of ice splitting wood, the low sigh of wind passing through needles, the absolute absence of human sound. Above them, the earth dome carried the new weight without complaint. For now, Ingrid stepped outside while the sky was still colorless, neither night nor morning. She circled the structure slowly, boots crunching through fresh snow, her gloved hand brushing the surface of the dome. The soil was cold, stiff with frost, but beneath it she could feel the mass that had protected her for years. It was enough for one person, perhaps even for three, but Ingrid did not measure safety by the present moment. She measured it by what would happen if the winter continued to worsen. She marked the ground with short cuts of a blade, where the posts would go, spacing them carefully, far enough from the dome to avoid transferring weight, close enough to shield it completely. She worked from memory and instinct, calculating angles not with numbers, but with experience. The roof would need to be high enough to allow snow to slide, steep enough to prevent accumulation, and strong enough to withstand storms that could last for days. When the boys emerged, bundled and silent, Ingrid set them to work immediately. There were no speeches, no explanations beyond what was necessary. Eric watched her marks in the snow and began to understand the geometry of the thing. Niels focused on clearing small areas, moving snow away from where posts would be driven. The cold numbed their fingers quickly, but the work warmed them from within, and Ingrid monitored their movements with a careful eye, sending them back inside when she judged it was time. The materials came from the forest itself. Ingrid selected trees with deliberation, choosing those whose removal would not destabilize the slope or invite wind through new gaps. Each trunk was evaluated for straightness, density, and age. She cut with steady strokes, conserving energy, letting the blade do its work. The sound of wood splitting carried through the forest, sharp and unmistakable. It did not take long for the settlement to notice. At first, people came out of curiosity. They stood at the edge of the forest path, stamping their feet against the cold, watching as Ingrid hauled timbers through the snow. When they saw the outlines forming around the earth shelter, confusion gave way to amusement. A roof over dirt seemed, to them, unnecessary at best, foolish at worst. Snow, they said, was insulation. Earth did not need protection. They had lived here long enough to know that. Ingrid did not respond. She continued to work, her movements precise, her attention fixed on the structure taking shape. The laughter carried to her ears, but it did not penetrate. She had learned long ago that ridicule was often nothing more than ignorance wearing confidence. The boys, however, heard everything. Niels faltered more than once, his gaze drifting toward the voices. Eric noticed this and compensated, taking on more responsibility without comment. Ingrid observed the exchange and made no remark. She understood that confidence, once earned, could not be forced. The frame rose slowly. Vertical posts were set deep into the frozen ground, packed tight with stone and earth to prevent shifting. Crossbeams followed, notched carefully to distribute weight evenly. Ingrid worked methodically, checking alignment again and again, adjusting by small increments. Mistakes in construction did not announce themselves immediately. They waited for the worst possible moment. As the structure grew, so did the commentary from the settlement. Some came more than once, bringing others with them, treating the work as a kind of entertainment. They spoke loudly, speculating on how long the roof would last, whether it would collapse under its own weight, whether Ingrid would finally admit her error and return to the settlement with the boys. Eric listened and learned something important. He learned that certainty did not require approval. He began to anticipate Ingrid's needs, handing her tools before she asked, adjusting supports while she focused on larger elements. Niels learned more slowly, but his fear diminished as the roof took form above them, tangible and solid. The weather worsened as construction continued. Wind cut through the forest, driving snow sideways, testing the partially completed structure. Ingrid altered her plan slightly, reinforcing areas that would take the brunt of the storms. She worked longer hours, resting only when necessary. The boys followed her example, not out of obedience, but out of understanding. Inside the earth shelter, the difference became noticeable almost immediately. The air grew drier as the roof began to deflect moisture. Temperature fluctuations lessened. Ingrid took note of these changes, storing the observations away even as she continued to work outside. The laughter from the settlement began to fade, replaced by something quieter. Doubt, perhaps. Curiosity. But pride kept most people from asking questions. They watched from a distance now, less vocal, less certain. By the time the roof was fully framed, winter had tightened its grip completely. Snowstorms followed one another without pause, layering weight upon weight. Ingrid worked with urgency but never haste, completing the final supports, securing the structure against the coming strain. The roof was not beautiful. It was not meant to be. It was functional, angled sharply, its surface rough and unfinished. When the first heavy snowfall settled upon it and slid away in sheets, Ingrid allowed herself a moment of stillness. The boys watched as well. Niels smiled for the first time since arriving. Eric simply nodded, as though something he had suspected was now confirmed. The forest closed around them once more, the settlement voices distant and muted. Ingrid stepped back inside the earth shelter, feeling the subtle shift in air, the increased stability. The system was not complete, but it was working. Above them, the roof waited, ready for the winter to test it. The roof was finished just in time for winter to reveal its true nature. Until then, the cold had been demanding but familiar, the kind that settlers believed they understood. What followed was something else entirely. The forest changed first, not in appearance, but in behavior. Snow no longer fell gently or even heavily. It descended in relentless waves, driven sideways by wind that seemed to find every weakness in the land. Days passed without any clear division between storm and calm, only varying degrees of hostility. Above the earth shelter, the new roof became a living element of the landscape. Snow struck it hard, accumulated briefly, then slid away in dense sheets, thudding to the ground around the structure. Ingrid observed this from within the forest, standing at measured distances, watching how the wind moved across the angled surface, how drifts formed and dissolved. Each storm provided information. Each night confirmed calculations she had trusted without proof. Inside the shelter, the difference was unmistakable. The temperature no longer fluctuated wildly when storms passed. The air remained dry enough that breath did not fog endlessly in the confined space. Moisture, once the most dangerous enemy of underground living, no longer crept along the walls or collected near the entrance. Ingrid checked constantly, her fingers tracing stone and packed earth, her senses tuned to the smallest change. There was none that concerned her. For the boys, the transformation was even more profound. Eric noticed first that the shelter no longer felt like a place they endured, but a place that responded to their presence. Tasks became predictable rather than reactive. Fire maintenance required less correction. Food stores remained intact. The oppressive anxiety that had followed them from the settlement began to loosen its grip. Niels slept longer, deeper, his body finally allowed to rest without constant vigilance against cold. Life settled into a rhythm dictated by necessity rather than fear. Each day began with inspections. Ingrid led them outside briefly, regardless of weather, teaching them to read the signs written in snow and wind. They learned how to judge whether the roof carried weight evenly, how to listen for stress in timber, how to spot subtle changes in snow texture that indicated dangerous accumulation. Eric absorbed these lessons eagerly, storing them away with the seriousness of someone who understood their value. Niels followed instructions carefully, learning through repetition rather than theory, his confidence growing with each successful task. The storms intensified. Wind screamed through the forest canopy, snapping smaller branches and driving ice into exposed surfaces. The settlement, visible only as a distant concept rather than a sight, began to suffer. Ingrid did not need to see it to know. The signs were obvious. The wind carried new sounds now, the sharp crack of splitting wood, the distant collapse of poorly supported structures. Smoke rose less frequently, signaling shortages of fuel or failure of chimneys choked by ice. From time to time, figures appeared at the edge of the forest path. At first, they did not approach. They stood at a distance, watching the roof, the earth shelter, the faint signs of life continuing in conditions that had begun to defeat more conventional dwellings. Ingrid acknowledged their presence only indirectly, continuing her work without pause. She had learned long ago that observation preceded understanding, and understanding preceded humility. The contrast between the shelter and the settlement grew starker with each passing week. In the settlement, roofs sagged under accumulating snow, requiring constant clearing that exhausted already weakened residents. Walls let in drafts that could not be sealed once the cold set in fully. Children fell ill, their bodies unable to withstand the combination of cold and damp. Fuel supplies dwindled faster than anticipated, burned not for comfort, but desperation. Ingrid's shelter, by comparison, required maintenance, but not struggle. The roof performed its role, redirecting snow and wind, preserving the integrity of the earth dome beneath it. The forest itself acted as an additional barrier, breaking the worst of the wind before it reached the structure. Ingrid took care not to disturb this balance, leaving fallen trees where they lay, understanding their role in redirecting air and snow. The boys adapted fully to the environment. Eric took responsibility for monitoring conditions, developing an intuitive sense for when adjustments were needed. Niels focused on internal tasks, managing supplies, learning how to recognize early signs of spoilage or moisture intrusion. Under Ingrid's guidance, their roles evolved naturally, shaped by aptitude rather than age. The laughter from the settlement ceased entirely. No voices carried now, only the wind. When visitors came, they came quietly, their steps hesitant, their posture changed. They no longer mocked the roof over earth. They studied it. The true test arrived in the form of a storm, unlike any the region had recorded in living memory. It began without warning, the sky darkening at midday. the wind rising to a constant roar that drowned out all other sound. Snow fell so thickly that visibility vanished beyond a few steps. The forest groaned under the strain, trees bending, some breaking entirely. Ingrid secured the shelter entrance, reinforcing barriers she had prepared precisely for this moment. Inside, the shelter held. The air remained steady, the walls dry. The roof above them took the punishment meant for the earth dome, shedding snow repeatedly, preventing accumulation that would have crushed lesser structures. The sound of snow sliding away became a reassurance rather than a threat. When the storm finally passed, it left devastation in its wake. Ingrid emerged cautiously, assessing damage. The roof stood firm. The shelter beneath it was untouched. Beyond the forest, the settlement lay damaged, altered in ways that could not be easily repaired. Ingrid saw movement then, figures making their way through the snow toward the forest, with a determination born of necessity. The winter had spoken clearly. It had tested assumptions, exposed weaknesses, and rewarded preparation without mercy. Ingrid understood that the next phase would not be about survival alone, but about what came after. Survival was no longer guaranteed for everyone. The forest remained silent, its verdict delivered without words. The first people arrived at the forest edge before dawn, moving slowly, as if uncertain whether they were still welcome in a world that had changed its rules overnight. The storm had stripped the settlement of its confidence. Roofs lay warped or collapsed beneath frozen drifts. Walls cracked where wood had shrunk too fast in the cold, and smoke no longer rose in steady lines from every chimney. What had once been a cluster of homes now felt like a scattering of shelters that had failed their test. Ingrid noticed them long before they reached the clearing. She had been awake for hours, listening to the forest settle after the storm, attuned to the subtle sounds that followed destruction. Footsteps in snow carried differently now, slower and heavier, each step measured, conserving strength. She did not hurry to meet them. She finished her inspection of the roof, checking joints and supports, confirming what she already knew. The structure had endured exactly as intended. When the visitors finally emerged from the trees, their expressions told the story more clearly than words ever could. These were not the curious onlookers who had once laughed openly, nor the skeptics who had shouted advice from a safe distance. These were people who had watched their own preparations fail. Their shoulders sagged beneath heavy coats, their faces drawn tight with exhaustion and cold. They did not mock the roof above the earth. They studied it. Ingrid did not greet them with ceremony. She acknowledged their presence with a nod and returned to her work. This was not indifference. It was deliberate restraint. She understood that pride, once wounded, required space to heal before learning could begin. They lingered at the edge of the clearing, speaking quietly among themselves. One by one, they stepped closer, drawn by the unmistakable signs of stability. No frost clung to the entrance stones. No ice glazed the walls. The shelter did not breathe steam like a struggling animal. It simply existed, calm and intact. The first request came hesitantly, wrapped in explanation and apology. A roof had failed. Supplies were ruined. Children were cold. Ingrid listened without interruption. When the speaker finished, she nodded once. There were rules, she explained, not with severity but with clarity. No one stayed idle. No one was given warmth without contributing effort. Knowledge would be shared, but not wasted. Work began immediately. Men who had once dismissed her methods now found themselves carrying timber through snow-choked paths, their hands numb, their movements awkward from disuse. Ingrid directed them efficiently, assigning tasks suited to their remaining strength. Some cleared snow from strategic areas, learning how accumulation patterns mattered. Others reinforced pathways, observing how Ingrid positioned barriers to redirect wind rather than block it outright. Women came next, their eyes scanning the shelter with equal parts hope and disbelief. Ingrid showed them how moisture destroyed more homes than cold ever could, how the roof prevented condensation by maintaining a buffer of still air. She did not simplify her explanations. She spoke as if they were capable of understanding, because they were. Eric watched all of this with quiet intensity. He recognized the shift immediately. Authority had moved without announcement. The settlement had come to the forest not as a place of exile, but as a source of survival. Niels, initially overwhelmed by the sudden presence of so many people, adapted quickly once given responsibility. He was assigned to help monitor interior conditions, learning to recognize when too many bodies threatened to raise humidity beyond safe limits. The shelter did not become crowded. Ingrid was careful to avoid that. She allowed access in measured numbers, rotating people in and out, maintaining balance. Those who worked hardest learned the most. Those who observed closely were invited to stay longer. What surprised many was Ingrid's refusal to take credit. She did not frame her methods as superior, only appropriate. She did not speak of triumph over the settlement, only of preparation that had begun long before the winter demanded it. Her lack of resentment unsettled some more than anger would have. As days passed, the forest clearing transformed into a place of shared labor. New structures began to take shape nearby, smaller versions of the protective roof, experimental at first, guided by Ingrid's oversight. She corrected mistakes without scolding, demonstrating rather than explaining whenever possible. The roof over earth became less strange as understanding replaced assumption. The laughter never returned. In its place grew a quiet concentration, a humility shaped by necessity. People learned to measure snow load, to respect angles and airflow, to value earth as insulation rather than something to be kept out at all costs. The forest, once regarded as a threat, revealed itself as a partner when treated with respect. The storm's aftermath continued to claim what remained of old certainty in the settlement. Some houses were abandoned entirely, their owners relocating closer to the forest edge where knowledge now lived. Ingrid did not encourage this, nor did she forbid it. She allowed the consequences of the winter to guide decisions. For the boys, the change was profound. They saw adults learn, fail, and adapt. They understood that knowledge did not diminish when shared, but multiplied. Eric began sketching designs in the dirt, adapting Ingrid's principles to different terrains. Niels learned to teach others the tasks he had mastered, discovering that confidence grew through responsibility. The earth shelter remained the center, not because Ingrid demanded it, but because it had proven itself. The roof above it stood as silent evidence that preparation was not excess, but foresight. As winter dragged on, survival became less desperate, more deliberate. The forest no longer felt like a boundary separating Ingrid from others, but a filter through which only those willing to learn would pass. The worst of the season was not yet over, but something irreversible had already occurred. The settlement would never return to what it had been. The laughter was gone, replaced by respect, earned not through words, but through endurance. The change did not come suddenly. Winter did not retreat in a single gesture, nor did the forest release its grip all at once. Instead, the cold loosened slowly, almost reluctantly, as if testing whether those who had endured it were truly ready for what came next. Snow remained thick beneath the trees, but it no longer grew heavier. The wind softened, losing its sharp edge, and the forest began to sound different. The deep, constant groan of frozen wood gave way to intermittent cracks and sighs, signals that ice was beginning to shift, to weaken, to surrender. Ingrid noticed the signs long before anyone else named them as spring. She felt the change in the soil beneath her boots, sensed it in the air inside the shelter, which grew subtly more elastic, less brittle. Moisture patterns shifted, requiring new vigilance. Survival did not end with winter. It merely transformed. She adjusted routines accordingly, teaching those who had stayed near the forest how to prepare for thaw, how to redirect meltwater before it could undermine foundations or flood storage spaces. The roof above the earth shelter bore the marks of its trial. Timber darkened where ice had clung for weeks. Grooves carved by sliding snow traced its surface like a record of storms endured. Ingrid examined every joint and support with the same care she had shown when building it. Nothing had failed. Nothing had shifted beyond acceptable limits. The structure had not merely survived the winter, it had preserved the integrity of what lay beneath it. The earth dome emerged slowly as snow receded, its shape revealed once more. Where other structures showed rot, warping, or collapse, Ingrid's shelter remained unchanged. Stone was dry, packed soil held firm. The entrance opened cleanly, without the desperate chipping and clearing that plagued homes in the settlement. Beyond the forest, the settlement itself bore the scars of miscalculation. Some houses stood abandoned, their owners having chosen to relocate rather than rebuild structures they no longer trusted. Others were undergoing reconstruction, guided now by principles that had been absent before. Walls grew thicker, roofs were angled more deliberately. Insulation was treated not as excess, but as necessity. People came to Ingrid less often now, not because need had vanished, but because knowledge had taken root. Those who had worked under her guidance during the worst of the winter returned to their homes, carrying not just memory, but understanding. They replicated what they could, adapting methods to their own circumstances. Some succeeded quickly, others learned through correction. Ingrid did not supervise them all. She had never intended to lead a movement. She had intended only to survive, and to ensure that survival did not end with her. Eric and Niels changed in ways that Ingrid did not mark with words, but with quiet acknowledgement. Eric had grown into responsibility that suited him. He spoke more now, not out of necessity, but confidence. He could look at land and see potential, not abstractly, but in terms of load, shelter, and sustainability. Niels, once so cautious, moved through tasks with assurance, his fear replaced by competence. He understood systems not through theory, but through repetition and care. The forest clearing no longer felt temporary. Structures built during the winter stood ready for dismantling or reinforcement as needed. Ingrid oversaw the careful removal of unnecessary elements, teaching that adaptation did not mean clinging to what had worked before, but recognizing when conditions demanded change. Snow barriers were dismantled, water channels were dug. The roof remained, unchanged, its purpose not diminished by the season's shift. Visitors still came, but now their reasons differed. They asked questions not driven by desperation, but curiosity. They sought guidance for future winters, not immediate refuge. Ingrid answered when asked, and demonstrated when words failed. She did not offer assurances. She offered principles. The forest itself seemed to respond. Wildlife returned cautiously. Tracks appeared in the snow, tentative at first, then more frequent. Birds tested the air with brief calls. Life resumed not with celebration, but with persistence. Ingrid stood one morning at the edge of the clearing, watching light filter differently through the trees. The roof cast a long shadow across the earth shelter, its presence both physical and symbolic. It had become more than a structure. It was a reminder that preparation did not require approval, and that wisdom often appeared excessive until necessity revealed its value. She did not consider herself changed by the winter. She had known what she was doing all along. What had changed was the world around her. The settlement would never again laugh at a roof over earth. It had learned, painfully but thoroughly, that survival was not a matter of optimism, but of respect for forces beyond human control. As the ground softened and the days lengthened, Ingrid allowed herself one rare moment of reflection. She had not returned to the settlement, nor had she remained entirely apart from it. She existed now in a space defined not by isolation, but by choice. People came to the forest because they wished to understand, not because they were forced. Eric and Neil stood beside her, their silhouettes framed by trees that had sheltered them through the harshest months. They did not speak. They did not need to. The lessons of the winter were already part of them, embedded deeper than memory. Above them, the roof remained steady, its work unfinished, not because it had failed, but because its purpose extended beyond a single season. It stood ready, not as a monument, but as a promise. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Watch the next video and explore other stories here. If this one mattered to you, share it so others can find it too.